Time to start on the fourth session of today, and it's a privilege for me to introduce Dr. Marcia McNutt, who will moderate this session and introduce the other panelists. Dr. McNutt is the president of the National Academy of Sciences. She's a geophysicist of substantial acclaim and was the editor of the journal Science from 2013 to 2016. Please welcome Marcia McNutt.
So good afternoon, everyone. I've invited my fellow panelists to come up here. On my right, I have Howard Bauchner, who is the editor-in-chief of JAMA and the JAMA network. And to my left, I have Meredith LeMasurier. I knew I was going to mess that up, who is at Nature Research, Life Sciences, and Veronique Kiermer, who is the publisher and executive editor of PLOS. And I'm looking forward to a lively discussion from this group of experts in academic publishing, who I'm sure will have much to say about the current status and future trends with regard to increasing the integrity, reproducibility, and rigor within research. So I was going to start with just, if I could have my first slide, a few introductory remarks for this panel, which is on journal perspectives in rigor and transparency. And these perspectives are just generic with regard to the entire publishing enterprise, not with respect to any particular journal. And let's start with the landscape that we're all facing, all of us in the academic enterprise. There are pressures that we're all facing. First of all, there's the growth in size of the enterprise. Depending on which particular discipline you look at, the increase has been from the late 1970s to today, everywhere from a factor of 2 to a factor of infinity in the size of the academic enterprise, where infinity is sort of from computer science, which wasn't even a thing then. But overall, the average increase in size of the academic enterprise is a factor of 4. And that's just in the United States. That's not even talking about internationally, where the increases in size eclipse that in many cases. Along with the growth in size just here in the US, research is becoming more international. The percentage of papers in the top journals with international authors has grown remarkably. And what that means is that we don't always know whether the cultural norms of our co-authors align with ours. We already talked about in an earlier panel the differences in what's considered plagiarism. If English isn't your first language, there's a huge temptation to just borrow language that was so beautifully said by someone else who is a native speaker in that language. We've also seen science become more interdisciplinary. And because of that, if you've got 5 or 6 authors on a paper and they're all in different fields or many different fields, you can't always check your co-author's work. And so who is responsible for the integrity of the entire piece of work if you know little to nothing about the work of your co-authors? And it's more competitive because of the growth, more pressure to show results, And we already talked about the increase in social impact. The stakes are higher, and the stakes are of more importance to more people. As Dean Goldman said this morning, life and death decisions can rest on the work that we do. So what has been the journal response to this? Well, journals, I'm really happy to say, have been one of the elements in the research enterprise that I think have been most responsive to these pressures. We've seen the increase in transparency. Brian Nosek mentioned already the top guidelines that have had a huge impact in terms of sharing data, sharing materials, sharing code, and sharing methods. Imposing more rigor in statistics. Many journals now put their papers through a statistics review. They have statistics boards that overlook papers either before or while they're out at review, et cetera. They've been developing checklists. We'll talk about that today. And mandating disclosure of relevant relationships so that it's easier for reviewers and for readers to understand where there might be sources of bias in interpretation of data and in experimental design. Now, one thing I want to almost give a heads up on or a warning of is in what success is going to look like with everything that the journals have been doing for transparency and for more openness. We can expect that success in terms of authors embracing more transparency in their research is going to lead to an increase in retractions. So Arturo Casadevall showed how retractions are going up in many journals. The journals where retractions are going up are some of the journals that have been in the forefront of transparency. It's really hard to see that an author's work is flawed if they haven't shared their data, they haven't shared their method, they haven't shared their code, and they haven't shared their materials. So there's going to be an increase in seeing what work is flawed as authors become more transparent. There's going to be an increase in corrections, again, because of transparency. And there's going to be an increase in irreproducible research simply because it can be seen to be such. In the bad old days, when no one showed their work and no one shared their data, we didn't know whether work was irreproducible because you might try to do the same experiment, but you weren't really sure. Was this really the same experiment? Because no one really described in any detail what they did before, and we can't really get at their original data. Now we can, and we know when things aren't reproducible. So none of these increases necessarily means that science is getting sloppier, and ultimately I believe that rigor will win out. But we have much to learn about the sources of irreproducibility, and that is going to be an important journey that we're all on together. I believe that journals are leading the way in this. The more forward-leaning journals have encouraged the slower-acting journals to adopt policies to encourage transparency, promote rigor, and counteract bias. This is part of changing the culture within publishing. Journals have seen these policies as clearly aligning with their values and goals of publishing reliable results. And so there's been reason why journals have been forward-leaning on this is it aligns with their basic mission and their basic values. But nevertheless, journals are at the end of the research pipeline. They're the last bastion. And policies that impact the input at the end, I have to ask, you know, this is, we'll discuss hopefully after we get everyone's presentations, this is a burden on the journals to have to be the final check on everything. And is this fair for the journals to have to take on this burden? Or should we be discussing more that can be done earlier in the research stage to make sure that journals are only doing a final check and not having to bear quite so much of this burden? So with that, I will pass the clicker on to Howard for his remarks.
Thanks, Marcia. So just a couple comments. First, I have no conflicts of interest to declare. I was struck that there were no statements of the previous speakers about that issue. It may be more of an issue that resides in clinical investigation. I think one of my overarching comments is JAMA and the JAMA Network Journals is a group of clinical journals. I'm well aware of many of the issues with respect to lab science, but my comments were largely focused on issues related to clinical investigation. And just as a reminder, JAMA is the flagship publication of the American Medical Association. It's editorially independent. And across the 13 journals, we publish about 5,000 papers a year. JAMA itself publishes about 1,100 authored papers, but of those 1,100 authored papers, about 200 are original research. And of those 200, they're drawn from a group of about 4,500 papers. Of those 4,500 papers, about 1/3 undergo peer review, and then of the 1/3, the 1,500, about 800 are discussed to give us a final cohort of 200 published original investigations. The numbers are a little different across the entirety of the network, but about 1/3 of the papers are now going out for peer review, or a few less. And I would say the other dramatic change over the last few years has been the way in which the network is now really digital first. So for example, when I started, JAMA had 13,000 followers on social media. This morning we have 800,000. When I started in 2011, JAMA had about 10 million views of its content a year. This past year we had 52 million views. And so the digitalization of the journals has really led to far greater reach. And about half of the views for all of the network are from outside the US. I just wanted to comment. Well, I don't think that's the next. Recurring themes. This is what we deal with on almost a weekly basis. There's scientific misconduct versus academic misconduct. It's been interesting in some of our dealings with different institutions. They have adopted the term academic misconduct. For us, we generally follow the NIH pattern of fabrication, falsification representing scientific misconduct. And then on occasion, plagiarism also comes up. Duplicate publication, I think you're aware of, is just slicing data quite thinly. Authorship disputes also are usually on our doorstep on a monthly basis. But the issue that really has reared its head in the last couple months has been conflict of interest. Many of us say it's rare that you want to be on the front page of the New York Times above the fold unless you win a Nobel Prize. Other than that, it's usually not very good. But there's many other issues that have already surfaced today that I would say we deal with on a regular basis, often with requests to change our policies, which we do very, very slowly for a host of different reasons. But when the American Statistical Society and then Nature published a commentary that suggested that we should retire the word significance, I received about 15 emails on that day saying, well, when is JAMA going to retire the language around statistical testing? So that would not be uncommon. Obviously, you've already heard about preprint servers, so the question is, how are clinical journals going to respond to preprint servers where there may be different issues than exist in non-clinical journals? We've tried to pioneer the issue of retraction with replacement. This allows authors to allows authors to tell us they found a major mistake in their research. Even after the mistake is found, there's still value in it. So the paper is retracted but replaced. And we believe it has actually increased transparency because authors are far more comfortable in admitting a major error if they feel like they're not going to be scolded and that the paper will simply be retracted. And I think that has really been an important change for us in trying to encourage greater transparency. Many other issues that we deal with on a regular basis. And there's evolving policies, of which probably the most important, and one of the leaders, at least in trying to understand what the intent of publication or of the scientific endeavor was, is trial registration, which debuted across the vast majority of journals for randomized clinical trials in 2005. And so in all of the leading clinical journals, for randomized clinical trials, they will be accompanied by a statistical analytic plan as well as a protocol. So you know what the primary analysis was meant to be, what the primary goal was. If there's changes in the protocol, they will be listed. So it will really be quite transparent as to what the intent of the research was done. We have not moved as quickly with observational data, although Eric Peterson from Duke had written a piece a few years ago in JAMA indicating that he thought some form of registration was as important for observational studies as it has been for clinical trials. But because of the importance of clinical trials in the evidence pyramid and in changing clinical practice, the focus to date has remained on clinical trials. I think the other issues that we confront on a regular basis, obviously, is the reporting of conflict of interest. We differentiate between opinion pieces, editorials, and original research. I think there's been progress around transparency and integrity. There's been no progress around the reporting of conflict of interest. And I think the events of the last year around this issue is making most institutions in the clinical vein reconsider the way the institution collects that information and how it should or should not be transmitted to journals. Some people have indicated that they believe that conflict of interest represents a form of scientific misconduct. And just my last two slides, we have an obligation to have transparent policies. And whereas I will only publish opinion pieces about the future of American medicine or global healthcare on a irregular basis, we do publish what our policies are on a regular basis. So we've had pieces on scientific misconduct, how we think about team science and how we can help display effects of team science in our pages. We've also published extensively on conflict of interest. And so we believe our policy should be transparent to the research community. And then lastly, I think there's two approaches to improving research integrity, particularly with clinical investigation. So-called checklists have existed in clinical investigation for almost 20 years. And I do know that lab-based science is trying to develop a similar set of checklists. So the Equator website has about 40 checklists for different article types. Without doubt, the most famous is the Consort checklist for randomized clinical trials, but they exist for meta-analyses, they exist for epidemiologic research, prediction models, case reports, case studies. And in our journals, we now link to those Equator website guideline recommendations. So when an author comes in, if they click a particular methodologic type, they can immediately toggle then to this checklist, and then they know that they will be held accountable for the rigor that exists within these checklists. And that should improve both the rigor as well as the transparency of the reporting. And then my final comments about transparency. As you've already heard, it's an obligation of everyone in this room, funders, authors, and editors. Authors need to be transparent with editors, editors need to be transparent with authors, and then editors in turn need to be transparent with the community that they serve. I do think because of other changes, the importance of being an editor has only increased. So for example, we often see how our work is portrayed in social media or in the media at large. And so we take much more care now than ever before to make sure that there's accurate reporting of the results of studies in our journals. We have less control about what happens in social media as well as in the popular press. And I think this is really a challenge as we go forward for the reporting of all science, but particularly science that really impacts people's lives on a daily basis.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you very much, Howard. I'm going to pass the clicker now over to Meredith.
Okay. More or less. I wish I had brought the printout.
I have a printout.
No, it's okay. I think I can manage. Okay, so I'm here to present the perspective from Nature Research. And as I put together this very brief presentation, I thought, what are the really important things that journals can do to support reproducible research? And so I think that there are 4 things, maybe I forgot a few, that are really key that we do. So the first is that we set strong policies. And for us, these would be on reporting standards, data, materials, code availability, things like this. We provide community resources. So, what we want to do is, in the pages of our journal. And so Howard mentioned, the commentary that we had recently on should we get rid of the idea of significance. I think, that is a discussion that should be had in all research communities, but for the natural sciences, I think it makes a lot of sense to really think about how much we rely on that. So we provide resources and an opportunity for the community to discuss these issues. We support external initiatives, so yeah, like the top guidelines, DORA, and things like this. And then we innovate and we try to think about how we can go beyond the research article. And so, for instance, right now, and a slide I'll show a little bit later, we're thinking about how can we improve code review for papers. So that is a really important aspect of studies that are becoming more and more important, as science is evolving. And how can we make sure that that is treated with the same rigor as the data in the papers? Okay. So I'm going to start just with a little history. In 2013, and I don't think I should talk about it because I wasn't at Nature Research at the time, but I will because here I am. We introduced a reporting checklist. And I think that this was a very critical and important first step for Nature Research in deciding that what we wanted to do was to really contribute very strongly to the research agenda. And so for us at that time, it was really about raising our standards of reporting on statistics, making sure that key elements of the studies were reported on. If you looked, aspects of, randomization, replication, blinding, in many of our papers, authors just didn't comment on it. And I'm not saying that that was nefarious. I think a lot of times people don't even think about it. And so we wanted to try to raise the bar with that. We wanted more information on the materials that were used in the study. And we've talked multiple times today that, in the past you couldn't replicate something because you didn't know how it was done. We removed length restrictions for methods at that time so people could just describe what they did in detail. And then we have also encouraged deposition of step-by-step protocols as companions to the paper in case people really wanted to follow along with the experiments. And we started encouraging more provision of source data. So since then, we've been building on that. I'm sorry, there's a lot of words on this slide. We altered our reporting checklist in 2017 to make it what we started calling a reporting summary. And we felt that the checklist had been really, really effective. It's not perfect. I don't think that there is a perfect tool. But one thing that we found that was a little bit frustrating was it was really very difficult for editors to police. It was difficult for authors, in some sense, to actually comply with. And so we started taking a different approach where we actually ask authors to provide the information in a structured form. We give them some guidance about exactly what details we're looking for there, and we publish that form along with a published paper. I should say a caveat. We publish that form along with a published paper in many domains except for the physical sciences, and we haven't quite figured out what one of these things would look like for the physical scientists. And it's always an interesting discussion because we're like, oh, bar graphs, and they're like, what are those? It's different. Anyway, we also expanded beyond life sciences. So this was driven by our life sciences, not surprisingly. We now have specialized questions for behavioral and social sciences and earth, environment, and ecology. And then we also update all of these sections routinely based on community feedback. Authors give us feedback. We actually work with the community to develop these. And then we combine them into one form. We had gotten to a point where we had like 6 different forms, and we combine them all. That's a little bit of a housekeeping thing, but I think I put that down there because this is one of the challenges that we face as a journal. We want to do better, but generally what that means is more forms for you guys to fill out. And it's been really hard to like crack that code. Okay. This is just a picture of it in action, so you can kind of see, you know, we ask people, and this is what it is, you know, did you exclude any data? And this is what an actual author, I just pulled this from a recent paper on the website, you know, did you replicate? Did you use blinding? There's no experimental group in this study. I mean, that's a pretty good explanation. But, you know, at least now, we're not like trying to say you have to use blinding, but as a reader, you know that they did or they didn't, and then you can use that as you interpret the paper. And then these are just kind of the various specific, what we call modules that we ask people on. And then I also just put a picture up here of statistics. Statistics are very challenging for us, to just be completely frank. Not all, like particularly life scientists, are great at statistics. I mean, I admit that, you know, in the lab, I probably could have been better at statistics than I was. So, you know, it's been challenging to like find a way to police really good statistics. And all I can say is like, you know, collaborating with statisticians is really important, and that's what we're trying to do as editors, but also something you should do as authors. Okay, and then this is just like a melange of the other things, and I just kind of wanted to point out a few of the things that we've been working on. So one is this code review that I talked about. You know, this FAIR data was an example on the right of something that was a community initiative, and it's about data sharing in earth science, and we were really proud to be able to support that in our earth science papers. You know, we're very big right now on like more deposition of data, and so we have a recommended repositories list that is managed by one of our sister journals, Scientific Data. Matters arising, to speak to Marcia's point, like we actually think indeed, you know, this is going to result in more critiques of papers and potentially more retractions. And so recently we just decided, okay, we're going to rebrand our format for these things and encourage it instead of shying away from it. We've also recently revised our competing interest policy. And I think I should, oh, sorry, no, I have a couple more slides. So the challenges, I think I've touched on them a little bit. By the time it gets to us, it's too late for changes to experimental design, so that's the big thing. You know, there's only so much we can correct at the end, and it generally is about transparency at that point. We do get some pushback from authors because we're asking you to do an awful lot of things, and it's very resource intensive for us. It takes a lot of time for us to police these things. The future directions, and it was exciting to hear about some of these things today, is that scientists need good training and mentorship so they know what they're doing in the first place. Statistical literacy, we need more on that front. And we need to work together as a publishing industry to have consistent standards across the board, and we are actually doing that. So with that, I will pass it over.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, now for Veronique.
Thank you. So to start, just very briefly, in the interest of transparency, to reveal a number of associations that you should be aware of. To Howard's point, I thought this was a place to actually use the disclosure statements. But in terms of so I'm representing here the views of the Public Library of Science. And in terms of our perspective on rigor and transparency, it's really that they are central to our definition of quality. Quality has actually many different definitions in the scientific literature. Very often it is associated with novelty and impact and importance. And we favor a definition of quality that is very much defined in terms of the reliability of results. Our goal is to publish findings that the research community can build upon, can rely upon to actually advance knowledge and eventually have a positive impact on society. So we're defining quality in terms of both the rigor and integrity. So when I talk about rigor, it's rigor with which the research is conducted and reported. And integrity is speaking about the respect of norms in a field, so for example, ethical norms in biomedical sciences. And I should make a small parenthesis here to say that most of my remarks actually are really steeped into the biomedical sciences. We have some clinical journals and also mainly biological journals. We touch on the social sciences and the physical sciences, but a lot of what's coming here is, as Meredith was saying as well, from the life sciences. And as we were saying at dinner last night, the life sciences in a way are way beyond the clinical sciences in addressing a lot of these problems. So quality defined in terms of rigor and integrity, we see transparency as a prerequisite to be able to assess these notions of quality. We demand transparency pre-publication so that manuscripts can be assessed deeply and that our editors and reviewers actually have access to the underpinnings of the research. But we also believe that it's important that transparency continues post-publication. As the remark was made this morning, publication is not the end. It's actually the beginning of science, of research being built upon. And if we want people to be able to build upon the findings that we publish, we believe that researchers need to have access to the data, the code, the details of the methodology and the analysis. And so it's very important for us to promote open science as an enabling strategy to guarantee and allow quality evaluation. So what does it look like in practice at the level of our journals? Well, the first aspect of open science in practice is really facilitating the dissemination or giving access to do all these various research outputs that are beyond the traditional narrative research articles. So I am talking about data, code, methodologies, and so on. Reagents, and so we have several ways of doing that, and I'll refer back to the slides that Brian Nosek showed this morning about the importance of policy and the importance of, at the other end of the pyramid, of enabling certain good practices. And so we actually use both levers depending on the situations. For example, we have a fairly stringent data availability policy by which we require all the data to be available at the time of publication. And then we have ways of facilitating the dissemination of other types of outputs. For example, we have a partnership with a laboratory protocols platform called Protocols.io, and that is actually a way of facilitating the publication of protocols related to a paper so that the methods section become all of a sudden much more rich and much more enabling for someone who would want to replicate the research. So that's really in terms of what we facilitate and give access to. The second category is really applying openness to our own processes, and we still have a lot of work to do on that. But we are promoting the posting of preprints as early as possible in the assessment of manuscripts for the reasons that were described this morning, and I'll come back to that. And also, we are working on implementing a more transparent way of communicating the peer review assessment that was done pre-publication. So within a few months, hopefully, authors will have the opportunity to decide whether they want the peer review history, all the peer review reports, as well as their answers to these critiques, to be published alongside the final published article. And then the third criteria here is something that I want to stress because I personally find that this is a very important and substantial problem in the biomedical literature, and is this question of publication bias. As Brian Nosek introduced this notion this morning, we collectively have a bias for positive stories of novel results. And that's very problematic because that means that the scientific literature is not an accurate representation of all the experiments and results that exist in labs around the world. And so it's a skewed representation of reality, and that can become very, very problematic. The clinical sciences have realized that a long time ago, and so it's already in. This is why pre-registration of clinical trials is so important, for example, and this has made it to the level of policy, and this is obviously a policy that we abide by as well. But then we are also trying to experiment with other things. We have journals with very inclusive publication criteria, for example, which welcome negative and null results. If it's rigorously done and reported, it should be published. And so we are offering and welcoming this. And then the second things as well is that we are starting to experiment with registered report, as you've heard this morning. How does that look like in terms of our editorial process? Well, the editorial processes that we have vary slightly depending on the journal, but the editorial processes are focused and adapted to focus on rigor and transparency. What's important is that even though these processes vary slightly from journal to journal, they are equally stringent regardless of the selectivity of the journal. And again, I'm coming back to this notion of quality here. Quality is very often associated with high selectivity in publication. Based on novelty. And that's one aspect, but with the notion of quality that we have, it's very important to actually focus on the research question and on the rigor of execution and reporting. And so we do that by using different combinations of actors. We have staff editors, and we employ employ the services of academic editors who are specialists in the field, and we find that this combination is actually very important. And so what we see typically is that staff editors are better placed to actually check on things like journal policies, like the things that Meredith just mentioned, ethics questions, overall focus of the design of the experiments in terms of a typical type of studies that need to comply with certain design, compliance with discipline norms in that sense, as well as in reporting and the reporting standards that Howard mentioned, disclosure of competing interests and so on. This is something that in our experience is best done by staff. And academics' time is best used in really focusing on the specialist and the scientific questions that are explored in the paper. Obviously, we are providing that consultation between staff editors and academic editors on all these questions as well. And so the other aspect that you see at the bottom of that slide, I mentioned in the previous slide that we are promoting preprints. And what we've introduced last year is that we are offering to authors at the time of submission, after we've done these initial checks, so that we are actually comfortable with the fact that there is no risk to public health or the environment, we are offering authors to post their paper as a preprint on one of the partner. We have only one partner at the moment, which is the bioRxiv server that you've heard about. So if it's in scope for bioRxiv, we will, and if the authors wishes so, we will post it on behalf of the author. And that has really helped, I think, increase the awareness around preprint servers and encouraged authors to consider that step very early in the process. It's important because that means that first the results are disseminated faster, but they can also be scrutinized by a much broader community than what's happening in our traditional peer review process, where we have a handful of specialists looking at that. And so I think that this opens up a way of peer reviewing, which is really having the opinions of peers in the broad sense, and we see these two processes as parallel and as complementary to each other. So just a few numbers, and this is my last slide. A few numbers to illustrate what that looks in practice. Since strengthening our data availability policy back in 2014, we've published more than 112,000 articles with a data availability statement, which tells you exactly where the data is and how to access it. Since last year, starting our partnership with bioRxiv, we've posted more than 2,400 preprints. We have just under 500 protocols associated with our papers in this database, Protocols.io, and we are doing our second trial with the Children's Tumor Foundation on registered report. And I'll stop here. I hope this gives you a flavor of the type of things we can do.
All right. Thank you so much, Veronique. Why don't we give a round of applause for all our wonderful editors up here. right. Before I open it up to everyone on the floor for questions, I have a few for these wonderful experts. First of all, I wondered if you could paint for me a picture of what the future might look for the efforts of the academic journal publishing for instituting higher standards in integrity, rigor, and reproducibility. Veronique, you talked about the need for staff editors in order to do these checks. Nature, of course, has staff editors. I'm not sure JAMA probably does too. These are expensive, and many society publishers would be hard put to staff up with a lot of staff editors. So maybe you could start with Veronique talking about what the burdens are that the journals are now shouldering to do all these added checks to ensure their readers of the rigor and integrity of the research they publish. And then maybe I'll hand it over to Howard to say something about how he sees the future of this evolving with better design in how we do it. And then maybe Meredith could talk about how this could all be seamlessly integrated into some of the processes that you talked about. So, Veronique?
Yeah, I think there is clearly a burden on journals to implement that, and I think one of the important things will be to invest in infrastructures and in standards, so that it's not the realm of only a small number of journals to be able to do that, but that actually the majority of journals can actually start actually allowing these same principles, because the point is that, I mean, there is absolutely a cost and a burden on staff editors. If it's not done by the staff editors, it's done by the academics, and it's also a burden in itself in the scientific community. So I think that it's going to be very important to have standards and infrastructures that allow us to do this more effectively, to decrease the cost of doing that, so that many more actually increase the quality overall in many more outlets.
Right, and so the truth is that it is the most successful premier journals who are doing this right now, because they're the ones that can actually afford it, but they can't expect that there's going to be uptake by rank and file until we find some better approach. So Howard, maybe you want to weigh in.
Yeah, so JAMA is well resourced. We have 6 full-time editors and 25 associate editors, all outstanding clinical investigators. So they handle all papers, and then every paper that we're considering for publication undergoes internal peer review. But we're well resourced. The other 12 journals are not as well resourced, although we maintain manuscript editing and statistical review for all manuscripts. So I think the future will change. I would anticipate, because we have developed excellent checklists for clinical papers, that within 5 years you'll see a form of artificial intelligence do the initial review on a paper. We've gone from 1 million papers in STM journals to 2.2 million in 1 decade. We simply have not doubled the number of research faculty. The US physician community already does more peer review than any other community in the world. And so we're overwhelming the clinical and scientific research community, so something needs to change. So you'll have the resource-rich journals, which will, I think, continue with very personal types of review. But I think ultimately, at least in clinical medicine, like you see with plagiarism reviews of manuscripts, Authenticate and others, you'll actually see the same type of review when a paper first comes in. It's also why we've driven reject without review up to 75 or 80%. We're just overwhelming everyone who's sitting around these tables, and it can't continue.
Thanks. Meredith?
Yeah, I think I'll say some very similar things. I mean, I think the idea of kind of establishing kind of standard expectations in fields, at least, I mean, obviously there'll have to be differences between clinical research and basic research, and even, you know, life sciences and physical sciences research. But I think the more that we could get on the same page as journals, and that becomes the standard expectation, you know, that there could be a trickle-down effect, because it's true, like the average journal does not have the resources in-house that we have. At Nature, we have over 350 employed in-house editors, which is just a huge amount of people. And it's just not practical. So we need to find more efficient ways of doing things. I think the infrastructure is actually a big thing, and I think most people, well, I don't know, probably if you've submitted a paper, you see how bad our systems are, right? You're like, why does this look like it's from 1987? You know, we don't have great tools actually in the publishing world to support us, and that's something that I think a lot of people are actually working on now and improving. And I think, like you mentioned some sort of AI screening. There's also people who are working on different aspects of it. So, you know, we try to keep an eye on that. People who are coming up with ways to maybe do some of the statistic screening in an automated way. And I think if we could do that, you know, then we would actually make it much more accessible. And then I think maybe my final point is this isn't so much about, you know, policy implementation, but just making the overall process of peer review more efficient. And that's why I think it's very interesting to see more kind of journals embracing portable peer review. And, you know, it used to be like if a paper had been, you know, reviewed at another publishing house, you wouldn't you know, you just wouldn't do it. And I think the walls are breaking down a little bit. We're realizing how much of a burden it is for a paper to go out there and be reviewed and reviewed and reviewed and reviewed. And I think maybe some of these things, as the community gets more used to it and the publishers get more used to it, will make the whole enterprise, you know, more efficient.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. A next question for all of you. As I said in my opening remarks, the review that the journals are putting all of these methods through, the data sets, the statistical treatment, all of that is coming at the end of the research process. Howard, we've discussed how journals are asking their authors for declarations of any significant other relationships they have that might be construed to be in some way connected to their research and make declarations. But yet, all of that information is presumably already known by their employers, because I know my employer asks me every year to make a full list of everything that I'm doing. So are in some way these burdens being passed along to the journal when there might be some place earlier in the process that it could be addressed that would be more efficient, more effective, and lead to more rigorous research, and more confidence in the result?
I'll just comment on two different issues, and then Meredith and Veronique can comment on others or the same. So the great success in clinical investigation and reporting has without doubt been randomized clinical trials. 2005, the International Committee of Medical Journal editors mandated that all clinical trials needed to be registered. And over the last 4 or 5 years, that's not only increased from just registration, but for the major journals, those reports also have to be accompanied by a statistical analytic plan and a protocol. The reasons was there was concern in the decade of the 2000s that clinical trials were being reported in which the primary outcome had been changed. There was selective reporting of both the primary and secondary outcomes. And much of this was influenced by financial conflict of interest. And there really has been a dramatic change. So I think there's a good example of where the journals did a good job about mandating something. It's not perfect, we know that. There's many, many reports about failed registration, lack of reporting in different databases where it's mandated. I think the struggle for the journals is we can't police everything, and that's the struggle. So what can we police where uniformly we could be effective at? Trial registration is one. ICMJE defined authorship criteria. They're generally consistent with COPE. They're used by virtually every journal in the world. So we've had successes. I think there's been some discussion around journal editors, for example, that the funders could play a more important role around data sharing by mandating it. The NIH has inconsistent policies about data sharing and what it means, both for observational as well as clinical trial. So I think, and I don't know about lab-based research, it's interesting the genetics community has embraced data sharing for years and years and years, although that's now under some restrictions because of the commercial interests in genetic databases. So for the first time, you're beginning to see some results from genetic studies not being entered into the national databases. So I think we just need to be careful about what we decide journals are very effective at and what they're not. There has been an argument that journals have not been that effective with conflict of interest, and that indeed institutions who collect that information may be more effective. So rather than us collecting it after you've already reported it, would it be better for us just to link back to the institutional statement of conflict of interest? Now again, the cultural issue, that works well in the United States. 40% of our authors are from outside the United States, where reporting of conflict of interest is very, very different. We were involved with a research institute in Italy where there was concerns about fabrication. And we wanted the institution to investigate, and they said that would be they would be pleased to do it after the civil case had been resolved in court. So that investigation took us 3 years. Wow.
If I may, I mean, I think that addressing as many things as possible earlier in the process is indeed something that we need to move in. And as you said, Howard, journals can't police everything, and we are at the end of the process. We have a very strong data availability policy. The authors who have challenges with that are not authors who don't want to share their data. The vast majority of authors absolutely want. They either don't have the data in a way that is shareable because they didn't think about that at the beginning of the experiments, or they don't have the infrastructure to share that data. So again, it's a question of supporting that and design. I mean, I think that another thing we are working on, and we're working with colleagues at Nature and other journals, on trying to harmonize these checklists that Meredith mentioned. Because you are, as authors, in a situation where you go to one journal, you have one checklist. You go to another journal, it's a different checklist. You go to a third journal, and it's yet a third checklist. And none of that was being asked by your funder at the time you got the grant application. If we can harmonize at least minimal standards in the same way that Equator has been doing that in the clinical sciences, and harmonize with funders, so that there is also a very positive education message there, where authors are being asked the same thing, researchers are being asked the same thing when they apply for a grant, when they write up their paper, and when they publish their papers. And so I think that these kinds of harmonization across this ecosystem of funders and journal editors and institutions in terms of what's being asked for in annual reports and so on is actually very important to really get that culture changing.
Yeah, I mean, I have very little to add other than to say I completely agree with what has been said already. And I think that things like today really show that we have common interests between institutions and journals. It's not that, you know, the barrier isn't that we're philosophically misaligned. We all want the same things. We just need to do a better job of talking to each other and actually implementing that in action.
I do want to point out there is tension about sharing data that underpin randomized clinical trials.
Well,
that is not a resolved issue at all. ICMJE had a statement about 18 months ago, and I would say in the response to the sharing of data, of the 300 responses, about 250 indicated that these investigators would be quite uncomfortable sharing data that underpin randomized clinical trials. And there's reasons for that. Firstly, is it an exploration to try to discredit the trial itself or not? There's a lot of commercial interest in randomized clinical trials, so that's first. Second, for those people in the audience who have conducted randomized clinical trials, you just don't hand someone's data to another individual and expect them to be able to analyze it. A SAP and a protocol is not sufficient. You need the actual playbook about additional information. So what's the incentive for sharing data? So I would say it's a goal. So we are now requesting statements about whether or not one would share data, but there's still a lot of attention about sharing data that underpin clinical trials.
Can
Okay.
I make a point?
Yeah, oh, yeah.
I don't want to distract the conversation to that, but I think it's a great example where we're not necessarily ready for that, because but it's also a question that how do we then move the infrastructure, how do we think about informed consent in ways that are actually compatible with sharing data more broadly for the right purposes? How do we think about, at the institution level, to have data access committee so that there is a mechanism to gate that access, but give access legitimately to people who want to ask questions? So I think that there are open questions, but there are things that the ecosystem needs to answer, not just the journals or just the authors.
Okay, so while I invite people from the audience to the microphones to ask their questions, I'm going to ask each of you to answer one final question. And that is, we've talked about incentives and other things that we've been doing, but let's suppose someone suddenly made you king or queen of the world, and you had the power to impose some policy or rule that you think would make a magnificent difference in terms of the rigor, the integrity, or the reproducibility of research, what would be the change that you would impose on the world?
Thanks for that question. I was hoping you were going to ask me about how I would try to improve health outcomes for a lot of people. That question I could answer. I think there is a model. I do think we've really come a long way with clinical trials. I think people need to, particularly with clinical investigation, observational studies, we saw an example of 2 studies that have different outcomes. Before we share data, we need to know what people are doing. So I would argue, particularly for observational studies, since we already have it for clinical trials, some form of registration. So we know what the goal was, what was the analytic plan, what was the secondary outcomes. I would start with that. I would not start with data sharing. I'd start with something that I think is easier to accomplish and there's broad agreement about. So I would start with ensuring that observational studies had a plan. And in fact, PCRI, the Patient-Centered Outcome Research Institute, you must register, even though most of the studies they funded are observational, you must register on clinicaltrials.gov what your primary outcome is, your secondary outcome is, and your SAP and your protocol.
All right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Meredith.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to limit myself to what we could do with currently available tools that we have, I guess.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yes.
Well, I think there is something that I feel would be meaningful that popped into my head, so I'm going to go with it. I'm going to talk about data sharing, and I think one thing that we did a few years ago, and Veronique mentioned this too, is having a data availability statements on all papers, and I think that's a really important step. But one of the things that I found a little bit deflating is that we get an awful lot of these data available at, by request from the author. And that's actually really inadequate and not very informative, and it causes some problems. And so if I could change anything, I would say that we stop having those types of statements, and they have to be much more clear. And even when you're not in a position, because we do dabble in some clinical research, and I understand the sensitivities around sharing that, I think then there just needs to be a very well thought out rationale for why it can't be shared.
So I already have your wish at PLOS, because we pretty much have, because we don't allow the access on, unless there are really specific restrictions, and we have run into some of them. But we're talking about Queen of the World here, which I kind of like the idea of. And so I would want to wave the magic wand and realign the system of incentives in universities and research institutions, so that it is aligned with the norms that we talked about this morning, and in particular the norms of openness and sharing, so that transparency becomes rewarded and openness is rewarded. And I think that that would propel us forward.
Wonderful. All right. If there are no questions from the audience, I can certainly keep going. Oh, Shai is going to the microphone. All right.
I was being
Please.
polite. I was waiting for others to get up.
All right.
So, Your Highnesses,
Thanks, Simon.
I'm sorry. I was trying to figure out how to address you. I mean,
Your Excellencies will do.
Excellency, that'll work. Yeah, okay.
Your Excellencies.
So I'm a little confused. So you all talked about that the journals at the end of the process, and you talked about policing. And my question, and it's kind of also like a comment, I was under the assumption that these requirements that the journals have put out now are just about transparency. It's just about tell us what you did. So I don't understand, first of all, why that would be policing, because it's just, requirement, tell us what you did. And I don't understand why it would be the end of the process, because the transparency is required for anything that's going to go forward. And it doesn't matter what what the institution says or does. Here the journal is saying, just when you report, we want to know everything you did. So that's kind of like a question. And I just wanted to say something about data sharing that the journals should be very proud of. And I'm going way, way back. So when the first ion channels were cloned by Numa, the infamous Numa, he reported the amino acid sequence, not the nucleotides. So no one else could clone it. And it was the journals that simply said, you've got to give us the nucleotides, not the amino acids. And so that was just a requirement for transparency and sharing data, simple kind of data, which completely revolutionized the field.
Okay. Do you want to take it, Veronique, or should I? Go ahead.
I mean, the question around policing is that, if you have a policy, it is toothless if you don't measure compliance. And that's what I meant by policing. So even if it's, and you're right that it's the type of requirements we've been talking about are transparency and reporting requirements. We're not dictating how research should be done. We're just asking, tell us how you did it. But tell us how you did it requires quite a bit of work to determine whether this is true. Demanding data availability, we actually do spend time realizing whether whether data has been shared and has been shared responsibly, to your point.
Yeah, and I'd say, Shai, that in terms of the top standards, the beauty of the top standards is they have a number of levels that journals have bought into them. Many journals are at the level where they do require data sharing, that the data must be available. They just can't say whether it is or not. The whether it is or not is at the top level 1. Most of the journals that have signed on to top are at top level 2, which says the data must be made available in order to publish in that journal, except under certain restrictions, and you must get a waiver, for examples like Howard had. So that is policing in a sense. But as Veronique said, not all journals have the staff to actually follow up post-publication to make sure that the data actually made it to the repository and is truly available. I talked to one editor for a journal that publishes 200 papers a year, and they had one staff member who was working, it was almost her full-time job, just to check all of the papers to make sure all of the data was available. And this is another thing that could be easily automated by AI.
I'm not sure if you meant, when you were talking about that we weren't really policing or you know, mentioning our approach to policing, if you feel that maybe we could be more activist in terms of telling people how to do the experiments. Okay, good. I mean, I was just going to say that's just not where we go, and I think for us that's really important to be responsive to the community, and that's why transparency is so important for us, so the reviewers can tell us whether or not something is up to the standard. But yeah.
Yes.
So a theme running through today has been how do appropriate standards get promulgated within a community, passed on to the next generation. And for hundreds of years, a major conduit for that have been the scientific societies. They're the organizations that are outside, you know, pan-country, pan-universities, et cetera. And you've mentioned society journals. Looking forward, as you talk about the pressures you're under with lots of resources, you mentioned society journals are under tremendous pressure without those resources. And of course, without society journals, the societies won't survive. So can you speak to what you see the future there and what needs to be done to make sure that these organizations thrive?
Yeah. Who wants to take that?
That's a really tough question.
Yeah, well, I can certainly start because this is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. So here's the dilemma that I see societies under. Many societies have depended on the income from publishing for their very existence. It's paid much of their indirect costs. It's helped them to support many of their programs that are not income producing, such as student travel grants and public outreach programs, public communication programs. And many of them are finding that their journal programs are at risk right now. And so the scientific societies themselves are very concerned about their own financial viability when they find their publishing programs under threat. One threat that they see is the fact that many of the commercial publishers are out competing them, and many of their members don't even know the difference between commercial publishers and academic publishers and understand the financial risks that their own organizations are under. So I think this is something that I think societies need to do a better job of, is educating their own members in the importance of supporting their publication programs.
I mean, in general, the business model for journals is dramatically different than 10 years ago. So if you look at the business model for most journals, it's flipped within a decade, which is really difficult to deal with. So whereas 10 years ago, 2/3 of income would have been from some form of print advertising, that market has essentially collapsed. If you don't have a professional society and you have individual subscriptions, they've essentially gone away. So Journal of Pediatrics has gone from 30,000 subscribers to 5,000 subscribers. So the business model is so radically different. It's created struggles for some societies, not all societies. Other societies develop other incomes. We're fortunate JAMA, the American Medical Association, is generally conceded to be well off. So what we need to return to the AMA has actually gone down over 10 or 15 years. So I'm fortunate, but that's not true at every society.
Yeah.
Can I just, I think this is also where the comment I was making around infrastructures and trying to facilitate that and decrease the cost of maintaining that quality is incredibly important. And as Meredith said, we are in the publishing industry relying on very old tools that are poorly adapted to the kind of things we want to do. And I think an investment there would actually very much benefit a very broad number of journals. Right. And we need to bring down the cost of publication. It is expensive at the moment, and it's part of the cost of research. And
most of these societies don't have the resources to be innovators.
Yep.
Yeah,
so exactly.
That's the problem. Okay, over here.
Hi, I have a question about data availability statements. I've seen data availability statements that the data listed in a repository doesn't match the data described in the article, or it's listed on a lab website that doesn't exist. Are there any plans to sort of police or check these data availability statements for their accuracy?
So I'll take that because this is something we have been dealing with. And again, we are limited in what we can do. So what we do with a data availability statement at the moment is checking that there is no undue restriction that is obvious from the wording of that statement. If it says the data is in a repository, we have staff that click on the link and make sure there is a data set there. It doesn't mean that we have the staff with the expertise to make sure that that data in the repository is actually the data needed to really underpin the paper. We're asking our reviewers to do that. And again, it's something that we are putting more and more on the community. And so it is not perfect, but it is a question of limitation and of what we can do with the tools we have. I think it's more important to still have a data availability statement, and when we receive post-publication a complaint that the data doesn't fit, we are dealing with that. We go back to the authors. In the majority of cases, the author says, oops, didn't realize I made a mistake. Here is the proper data set, and these things are being resolved. So we don't have perfect systems completely, but the cost of actually checking everything pre-publication increases the cost of publication at this time. And I think thinking about these verification before and after publication is very important to move in that direction as well.
So when I was editor of Science, I got a complaint that data was not available as it had been claimed in the paper. And so I contacted the author and said we were going to publish an editorial expression of concern if the author didn't fix it immediately. And you can be sure it got fixed immediately. Arturo.
Marcia, I want to second what you said about the journals and just add a little bit more. So societies, it used to be the job of societies to run the journals, and then they began to put in meetings, and that entire economy is collapsing. I'm aware of 3 societies that are reeling as a result of this because whatever money they made with the journals went back into science to run conferences, and now they can't. The society journals are getting squeezed from 2 areas. From the high-end journals, as you know, Nature and Cell have launched 30 journals in the last 20 years that have basically began to suck up the space of a lot of very good papers. And they're getting squeezed from the bottom from the mega journals. And the space, but most scientists don't really know, about this. And we published an editorial last year about this, and we are trying, in our laboratory, we're trying to make the decisions often. I mean, this year we're publishing in multiple places, but whenever possible to publish in society journals, because to support them. I think societies are critical, and I don't know how they're going to find sources of income or sources of revenue to make the transition to a different business model.
Yeah. So I think it would be very incumbent upon societies at this point to understand from their author community what has been attractive about these other publishing options. And one thing I think is true is that the commercial publishers have had the resources to invest in innovation, and they've been able to provide publishing new publishing bells and whistles that the society publishers haven't. And the mega publishers have been able to provide a sort of one-stop shopping for looking for vast numbers of papers in the internet generation, which have made it easier to have your paper be visible. That wasn't the case when it was just printed, between 2 pieces of cover. So I think that these lessons should be learned, and I think if the societies banded together, they could find ways that but collectively, they could counter these trends.
So that's beginning to happen, but you know, these societies are not nimble, as you know, not nimble.
Okay, over here.
Hi, so it's important for authors to disclose their conflicts of interest, but how do editors consider a peer reviewer's conflict of interest? Because this might propagate bias or irreproducibility in the literature.
Sure. Good question.
I mean, we do it in a rather unstructured way, which we probably could think a little bit more about now that you asked the question, and we do occasionally think about that. It hasn't been as important at this point for us to think about as author conflicts. But we do ask every reviewer before they agree to review the paper to consider whether they have any conflicts and to decline if they do. Now, I would say that that works, you know, in the vast majority of cases. We do have instances from time to time where we might have something where an author will come back and say there's something strange in the review, and you know, very, very rarely we will have an instance where we feel that a reviewer has taken a review when they had a conflict, and then of course we have to, you know, discount that feedback. But it is an interesting thing to think about. We don't have a structured form, and I don't know if anybody else does.
We use, I mean, we have certain rules in terms of excluding collaborators in the past few years and things like that. So these are things that we do check, but it's also where the role of the editor is actually crucial.
Yeah. So because of our processes, it has not been a major issue. So firstly, we ask peer reviewers to recuse themselves if they believe they have a conflict of interest, and we provide a definition. But more importantly, the handling editor, the associate editors, we meet once a year, and they also recuse themselves if they have a conflict of interest. But like virtually every other journal, peer reviewers are consultants to us. They do not make the final decision. And so in all cases at JAMA and the JAMA Network journals, and I'm assuming PLOS and Nature, individuals without any conflict of interest are making the final decision on manuscripts. I fully appreciate that there could be a concern that a type of peer review could influence that final decision. But during the 7 years I've been at JAMA, I haven't had a single complaint from an author indicating that they were concerned that either the peer review or the handling editor had a conflict of interest. We have many problems. I don't think that's one of them.
Okay.
Michelle Kiley. I was a journal editor for 7 years in the early 2000s, and last year I was a guest editor for a PLOS journal. And my problem was that with the explosion of journals, getting people to, like the good people to agree to review a paper was just overwhelmingly bad. I mean, I kept saying, every time I would get an email saying they refused, I was just horrified. Like, who am I going to get to review this paper that I think is good? And so you end up with, I mean, I don't know what you do about that.
You're completely right that this has gotten worse. The reviewing burden on the community, I think has increased, and it's more and more difficult. We have data from our own processes that it's harder for editors to find reviewers now than it was 4 years ago. So
And there's not a week that goes by that I don't get requests to review.
It is absolutely an issue, and so I think that there's a couple of things that we're looking into there. I mean, one is what Meredith mentioned around, thinking more about peer review as something that is more journal agnostic, because it actually is based on some principles and can be portable from one journal to another. I think that's one important aspect. I think putting some attention into training new reviewers is also very important. We've talked about education earlier. I mean, being a peer reviewer is part of the life of all research scientists, and it's actually quite rare that people are formally trained on this, and finding ways of actually bringing more reviewers into the pool in a controlled way, so you actually have the quality of reviews that you want, I think is very important as well.
Thank you.
So preprints sound like the right thing to do. I think in clinical medicine, there's some concerns that things could be placed up on a preprint server that could do untold harm. So I would argue that any paper on a preprint server that indicated a particular vaccination is linked to autism would just do a remarkable amount of harm based upon current data and Bayesian analysis. The likelihood of that being true is very limited, and it would unequivocally be picked up by social media and the popular press. But if one believes that preprint servers can serve as a form of peer review, and I'm still skeptical that it does, then the comments on a preprint server should be submitted to a journal, and the author should indicate how he or she responded to those comments. I suspect that a very, very small number of articles on preprint servers will ever see any comment.
So when I was, back when I was editor of Science, we had a meeting at AAAS in which a number of editors from journals attended. And what was interesting was the data that came from the American Chemical Society and the American Geophysical Union, because they could link their authors and their reviewers to their member database in order to understand where they came from, their gender, their age, et cetera. And what was interesting was, although the authors were international from all over the world for both societies, their reviewers were white, male, North American largely. And so clearly this issue is we have to find, train, and certify a much broader pool of reviewers that matches the author pool. So, and I agree that portable would help as well. So, yes, next question.
Yes, on a slightly different angle, you alluded to papers that, you know, make a circuit and get reviewed over and over again until they find a journal home. Some journals request that you tell them if the paper's been rejected elsewhere, and also to even give the reviews or some substance along with it. I think that's a great idea, but do you think it's a great idea, and do you think it's enforceable at all? What comments do you have about that?
Well, when articles travel from another journal to us, we usually know because they don't reformat the abstract, so that's the first. And then secondly, they'll write, "Dear Dr. Drazen," and I then go, "I'm not Dr. Drazen. Jeff and I are friends." So often we know. Often it's the same peer reviewers. So the peer reviewer will say, "Oh, by the way, this visited me from another journal." That's not uncommon. So I always tell people, reformat it, and if you don't want us to know, you should indicate who you don't want the manuscript to go to, but we don't pay much attention to that. We've had a fair amount of success in asking people. We ask in our instructions to authors, if an article's been submitted elsewhere, could you please let us know, and would you kindly share the reviews with us? Because then we send that article out to less peer reviewers. That's the goal, to reduce the burden on the people in this room. Also, any article that comes into JAMA or a JAMA network journal and cascades to another journal, it cascades with those peer reviews. So that journal editor, if a paper goes from JAMA to JAMA IM and Rita Redberg is the editor-in-chief, she will only send it out for one additional review, because all the articles at JAMA have a stats review. So we really have tried to reduce the burden on the reviewer community. We're about to experiment at one of the journals that's really struggling. It's one of the smaller journals. So what we're going to try to do is identify 25 people who agreed to review a single article a month. And they will be noted on our website. And people don't want money, but we're going to take them to dinner.
Oh, people want wine.
Yes, so we are. So that journal wants to experiment with a cohort of 25 identified reviewers.
It's an interesting idea, actually. You know, we don't ask people to disclose that. And when you first said it, I thought, well, that seems kind of crazy. But now that I've sat on it for a minute, it actually sounds kind of interesting. Yeah. And I guess one thing I can really add to that is, you know, I know from an author's perspective, you probably feel uncomfortable about an editor knowing that you had submitted a paper elsewhere because maybe we weren't your first choice and we're not going to feel special. But yeah, no, I was just going to say it's not true. I think that every editor recognizes the author's need to advocate for themselves, and we respect choice. And so you know, if you feel that you have information from previous rounds of review that would be helpful, I would encourage you to share it, because it doesn't have a stigma.
I think that, you know, I completely agree with what they've both said. I think there is another thing that we can do collectively to try to facilitate that, is for reviewer reports to actually be constructive. You know, a reviewer report that says this is not a paper for whatever, Nature Genetics, because of these 5 problems, is not very constructive when it goes to another journal. So, I mean, making sure that reviewer reports, hence the importance of educating people in how to do constructive peer reviews, will facilitate that portability as well.
Okay, we're to the end of our time. Is there one last quick question? Thank you.
More of a comment, and maybe this is where the idea came from, but in terms of the preprint idea, it's my understanding in the field of economics that the papers don't go to a journal. There's a circle, and it's a sort of a fairly structured process. I don't know if there's something between preprint and economics review that could be implemented in this area.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that we're going to be seeing a lot of experimentation on preprint servers, and we're going to be seeing a lot. You know, let me just say this. I remember it wasn't that many years ago that journals were afraid of preprint servers and kept them at arm's length. Then we got to the point where journals were okay with preprint servers. And if a paper had been on a preprint server, it was fine to submit it then to your journal. And now we see, as Veronique has said, that they are actually facilitating the posting of a paper after it's gone through their initial quality checks to the bioarchive. Yeah. So this has been a change within a decade of this relationship.
I mean, even less. And
less.
Not only that, not only facilitating posting of preprints, I mean, there are editors that are, trolling is maybe not the verb I want to use, but are on preprint servers looking for papers to encourage. I mean, it's been a huge change.
So it is. It is a sea change, like the tide. Instead of going out, it's coming in. And I think it's a major change, and I think we're going to see this very symbiotic relationship between preprint servers and journals that's going to be much more like the archive relationship with journals. So I'm very positive about these trends. So thank you all very much. Let's thank our panel again.